The confrontation. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the figure in the living room slowly advanced. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, filled with an unnatural hunger. The cold air swirled around her, chilling her to the bone. Her hand shook violently as she clutched the kitchen knife, though deep down, she knew it was useless. This thing, whatever it was beyond her comprehension. The figure moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring the fear radiating from her. Emma's back was pressed against the basement door, her only escape route blocked by the very thing she dreaded. She thought about running, screaming, anything to get away, but her legs felt paralyzed. A voice broke the silence, the deep and distorted, echoing from all around her. "You shouldn't have come back." Emma's heart raced, the weight of those words sinking in. Whatever this entity was, it had been here long before she ever stepped foot in this house. She realized now that this wasn't a prank, not some twisted joke. This was something ancient, malevolent, and it had claimed her home. She had to act fast. Summoning all her courage, Emma turned and bolted for the front door, throwing her weight against it in desperation. The door rattled, the lock refusing to budge. She fumbled with it, hands trembling, as the figure glided across the room, closing the distance between them. In a moment of panic, she dropped the knife and grabbed her phone, dialing 911. The line rang once, then twice. Just as she thought someone might answer, the phone went dead. No dial tone, no sound, just silence. The coldness in the room intensified, and she felt a presence behind her. "You can't leave," the voice whispered, so close that she could feel the cold breath on her neck. Emma spun around, but the figure had vanished. The room was empty again, but she knew better now. It was still here, lurking, watching, waiting. She needed to figure out what it wanted. She couldn't keep running forever. Her eyes darted to the family pictures on the walls. Could this thing be tied to the house? Had something happened here before her family moved in? She racked her brain, trying to recall anything unusual, any stories her parents might have mentioned. Then she remembered something. An old newspaper clipping her dad had shown her when they first bought the house. It was about the house's previous owners. A family just like hers had lived there years ago. One night, they had all disappeared without a trace, vanished into thin air. No one ever found out what happened to them. The house had stood empty for years, until Emma's family moved in. She hadn't thought much of it back then, but now she realized that maybe they hadn't left. Maybe whatever had taken them was still here. She rushed upstairs to her father's office, hoping to find that old newspaper clipping. The office was a mess, papers scattered everywhere. She rifled through the drawers frantically, her heart pounding as she heard faint footsteps approaching from the hallway. Finally, she found it. The yellowed, faded article. It described the strange disappearance of the Randall family, who had once lived in her house. According to the article, they had reported strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. Phantom noises, cold spots, and sightings of a shadowy figure with glowing eyes. Emma's blood ran cold. It was the same figure she had seen. Before she could process it any further, the room grew colder, and the lights flickered. Emma felt the familiar presence looming behind her. She turned slowly and saw the figure again, standing in the doorway, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "You know now," the voice whispered, growing louder and more menacing. "You can't stop me." Emma's pulse raced. The entity had claimed the Randalls, and now it was after her. But she wasn't going to give up so easily. She remembered her mother telling her about an old church nearby, one with a priest who dealt with the supernatural. If she could make it there, maybe, just maybe, she could be free of this nightmare. Summoning every ounce of strength, Emma dashed past the figure, racing down the stairs and toward the front door. This time she didn't fumble with the lock. She kicked the door open and ran into the night. The wind howled, and the darkness of the street seemed almost alive. But she didn't stop. Her only goal was to reach the church. Behind her, she could hear the footsteps. Faster now, louder. The figure was following her, closing in with each step. She didn't dare look back, her lungs burning as she sprinted through the cold night air. Finally, she reached the church. The doors were heavy, but she pushed them open with all her might and rushed inside, collapsing in a pew, breathless. The silence of the sanctuary felt almost comforting compared to the terror that had been chasing her. She was safe, at least she thought she was. A priest appeared from a side door, his face calm but stern. "What's wrong, child?" he asked, his voice steady and soothing. Emma, still gasping for breath, tried to explain the horror she had experienced. The figure with the glowing eyes, the texts, and the strange occurrences in her house. The priest listened carefully, his face grave. "You've encountered something very old," he said quietly, walking toward the altar. "An ancient spirit bound to your home. It doesn't want to harm you. It wants to take you, just like it took the others." "What do I do?" Emma asked, panic rising in her voice. The priest hesitated for a moment before answering. "You can't defeat it alone. But there is a way to sever its connection to your house. We must perform a cleansing ritual tonight. It's your only chance." As they prepared for the ritual, the church lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the sanctuary. The presence was here. It hadn't given up. The doors slammed shut, and Emma knew the confrontation was far from over. The figure was waiting, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. Inside the dimly lit church, the air felt thick with tension. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and move as if alive. Emma stood next to the priest at the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. The flickering candles illuminated the priest's serious face as he prepared for the cleansing ritual. "The spirit that haunts your home has latched onto your fear, Emma. It feeds on it," the priest explained. "This ritual will break its bond with the house. But you must stay strong. Any doubt, any weakness, and it will try to possess you." Emma nodded, swallowing the lump of fear lodged in her throat. She could feel the entity's presence lingering just outside the church, waiting, watching. The cold sensation had followed her all the way here, and now it seemed to be pressing in on her from every direction. The priest began chanting in a low, ancient language, drawing symbols in the air with a small vial of holy water. As he did, the temperature in the church dropped even further. Emma shivered, hugging herself as a sudden gust of wind blew out several of the candles. The doors rattled violently. The entity was trying to get in. The priest didn't falter. His chanting grew louder, more forceful. He handed Emma a cross and told her to hold it tight. "This will protect you. No matter what happens, do not let go." Just as Emma gripped the cross, the doors burst open with a deafening crash. The figure stood at the threshold, its tall, shadowy form outlined by the faint light from the street outside. Its glowing eyes locked onto Emma, and the wind that followed it sent chills through her entire body. The figure stepped into the church, unfazed by the sacred space. The candles flickered wildly, casting strange shadows across the walls. The priest held up his hands, chanting louder now, the ancient words filling the air with power. But the entity didn't stop. It moved closer, gliding silently over the stone floor. Emma could feel her heart pounding in her throat. The cross in her hand burned cold against her skin, but she clung to it as though it were her lifeline. The figure's eyes were fixed on her, filled with something far more terrifying than malice. Hunger. Suddenly the church lights flickered and went out. Darkness engulfed them. Emma could barely make out the priest's figure, but his voice remained steady, unwavering. His chanting seemed to create a barrier between them and the entity, but she could feel the spirit's pressure growing, trying to break through. A voice echoed in the darkness, low, menacing, and all too familiar. "You can't escape me, Emma. You are mine." Emma's hands tightened around the cross, but the voice was inside her head now, twisting her thoughts, making her doubt. What if the ritual didn't work? What if this thing took her like it took the others? The fear welled up, and the air around her seemed to thicken, suffocating her. The priest turned to Emma, his voice urgent. "Do not listen to it. Stay focused." But it was too late. The figure lunged forward, its glowing eyes burning with intensity. It reached for her, its long, shadowy fingers stretching out as if to pull her into the abyss. Emma's legs buckled beneath her, the fear overwhelming. She felt frozen in place, the figure's icy grip closing in. Then, just as the shadow was about to engulf her, the priest splashed holy water onto the floor between Emma and the entity, his voice booming with the final words of the chant. "In the name of all that is holy, I banish you from this place." A deafening roar filled the church as the holy water sizzled and smoked on the ground. The figure recoiled, its form flickering wildly like a flame in a storm. The glowing eyes blinked out, and for a moment, everything was still. Emma gasped for breath, feeling as though she had just surfaced from drowning. The shadowy figure began to twist and writhe, as if being pulled apart by some unseen force. Its shape contorted, breaking apart into smaller, formless masses of darkness, until it finally dissipated into nothingness. The church fell silent. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the coldness began to fade. Emma could barely believe it. The entity was gone. The priest collapsed onto one knee, exhausted from the ritual. "It is finished," he whispered, wiping the sweat from his brow. He glanced at Emma, his face lined with fatigue, but also relief. "You're free now." Emma's legs trembled as she stood, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She was free? Was it really over? She looked around the quiet church, half expecting the figure to reappear, but there was nothing. The air felt different, lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted, but just as Emma allowed herself to breathe, a familiar chill swept over her. Her phone buzzed. With shaking hands, she pulled it from her pocket. Another text from the unknown number. "This is only the beginning." The blood drained from Emma's face. She looked at the priest, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not over, is it?" The priest's expression darkened. "No, this was only a small part of what's to come." Before he could say more, the church door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the building. The temperature plummeted once again, and the candles flickered out, plunging them into complete darkness. And then from the far end of the church, a pair of glowing eyes appeared. Not one set, but two, then three, more. They blinked into existence one after another, filling the shadows surrounding them. The priest's voice was strained but steady. as he gripped Emma's arm. "Run,"